It's 4 o'clock in Radio Cairo. This is World of Info. My name is Dr. Amr MABROUK. Dua Muhammad is at the control, and I'm here with you from 4 to 5 p.m. in this beautiful afternoon in Cairo. Well, today is a different program. Usually every month I present the books that I have read during the past months, and today is our time with the world of books. Yes, the world of books coming from the world of info. And today you know the rule of the game that we always play. We present 3 books that I have read during the past month of May, and my advice to you, should you read the book, skim it or toss it. And since I found the time to, in my busy schedule, to read these books in details, I believe that every book of this collection should or deserve to be read. But just if you don't have enough time, I would try to attract your attention to some of the important points in the book. In these books, maybe you'll find the time, maybe I'll attract your interest, and maybe you will try to read these books, because definitely these 3 books of today are interesting. So what are the name of these 3 books of today? We have Paul Kennedy, the famous historian, the professor of history in Yale University, and the author of one of the best-selling books of all time in history, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, is giving us one of the new and the best products of history, Victory at Sea, the Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, a book that has been recently published in 2022, and a book that will dedicate a big or great deal of our program to it, to try to analyze it, grab it, and grasp it, and attract your attention to it. And the next, or the second book, is The Uses and the Abuses of History. It's a short, beautiful book by a historian, a professor of history. This time she's Canadian, and her name is Margaret Macmillan. And she has written a very interesting book, in which she has presented in 150 pages a summary of her presentations in one of her courses about, should we understand or should we read history to use it, or should we abuse the history in reaching conclusions in our life, or history is just a book of interest that we might read or toss or skim and it will never be repeated? Or does history repeat itself?
With a registered nurse, not to cry in front of people at work, well that's hard at times.
And the third book is another historical book, and I believe this is one of the leading books of today as well. It's by Helmi Namnam, the ex-Minister of Cultural Affairs in Egypt, and it's The Days of Selim I in Egypt and the Roots of Terrorism. Well, that's an interesting book. It's a short book, only 150 pages. It deserves to be read, it deserves to be analyzed, it deserves to be taken for to understand and to dwell into these things, or the secrets in between the lines.
You don't need me. You don't look well.
So I believe we should start with the first book, with a book that took from me some time. It's almost 500 pages, and it's definitely an interesting book by Paul Kennedy. And Paul Kennedy is a historian, he's a professor of history. He has written one of the best seller books as regards the New York Times, and of course it's about Victory at Sea, the Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, published in 2022 with paintings by Anne Marshall. Well, the moment I got this book, I thought to myself, well, I've read a lot of books about World War II. What will be this as an addition to my knowledge of history? Should I waste time to read more about certain naval skirmishes and battles that have passed all through in the 7 oceans, as they will see, or all the seas of the world during the World War II, which extended from 1939 till 1945? Is it of interest to read this book? Is it really interesting to get into details about navies, about submarines, about capital ships, about aircraft carriers? What's the importance of reading such a book today in 2022? Well, I started reading this book with a lot of skepticism, thinking that I will pass the time and read. Maybe this was in the early May, and they were having some time during the Eid vacation. So I started reading it and said, I will definitely read only 50 pages. I will skip it, and I will get into other more serious readings. But this was a serious reading. Why is it serious? Because Paul Kennedy is a professor of history. He's not just any writer, and he's working in Yale University. Well, okay, that's good. That's great. Good prose, maybe, yes. Yes, it is good prose. But the analysis is very important. Why the World War II was going to happen sooner or later, and what pushed the world to this great conflict that led to the death of huge lives, and how geography has affected the battles of the Navy and the sea battles, and how many navies were there that could stand and make a great effect in the war, and could the Navy win a war or not? Well, this is what is in between the lines, and this is what you can really find of great interest, because Paul Kennedy went into the agreement that was done in the Versailles Treaty and later on in the treaties that went in order to propagate the peace by limiting the number of heavy ships and heavy carriers to be made during the 30s. And so there we have to analyze and find out that there are only 6 navies that were strong, powerful, and formed the superpower in the marines, or in the marine life, or in the oceans and the seas of the world. And these 6 navies are the UK, the United States, France, Italy, Japan, and Germany. Germany came out defeated of World War II and was prohibited and prevented by law from building boats, cruisers, and aircraft carriers. And the second important point is that the seaports of Germany are not that free seaports, and they are not having a big exposure, and usually their boats and their ships will always have certain difficult times to get out through the Northern Sea into the oceans, and they will find a lot of intruding navies and competitive navies, and of course we have to give a mention to the British. If we started with the weakest navy in the 30s, which is the German Navy, we'll find that the strongest navy in the world was Britain. And the UK Navy is definitely one of the great pillars of building the British Empire. And if Britain didn't have a navy, it could have never been an empire. It's the navy that brought the British Army all over the world. It is the navy that has chosen to build into the whole world an important basis for this navy to secure the transport of the merchandise from the occupied countries, and to transfer as well the soldiers and the armies and the administrators. And as the most important point is that they were carrying the guns enough to silence any resistance and to enforce by the law of weapons and the law of guns the authority of the British Empire. And as we look at the possessions of the British Empire, we'll always find strong bases. Whether these bases are in India, in Singapore, in Aden, in Alexandria, in the Western Africa, all these important, in Guam, all these important seaports were very important as a sort of stigma of the presence of the British Empire. And the navies all over that, the strong British Navy that came out victorious from First World War, still was enjoying a lot of force and still was enjoying an edge in building boats and building strong ships in spite of the law that was reached through the agreements or the peaceful agreements after First World War in the 30s to demolish or to decrease the armaments of the Navy. We find another Navy, of course, which is the American Navy, which was the second by far to the first Navy of the world, and this is the American Navy. And the American Navy has something which makes it very special. The fact that the United States of America is actually a continent that has deep sea ports that extend from the east to the west. And not only that, it has a very strong base in the middle of nowhere of the Pacific, which is a state of the United States, and that is Hawaii. And that has a very important strong base called Pearl Harbor. The ports, the strong economy, in spite of the fact that the United States was coming out of the Great Depression, yet this is a continent, not a country, that has all types of raw material and has a huge population that is properly educated, technically, and capable of building endless supply and gathering endless supply of raw material, producing, if you want, cars, like the cars that are produced in Detroit, or these factories with certain modification can be changed into factories that are producing mega projects of aeroplanes, thousands of them, hundreds of ships, and hundreds and thousands of tanks that can really become victorious out of any war. But at that time, the United States was isolated. There was a lot of isolation, and it was not involved in the beginning in the war until 1941, and 1941 actually in December. So almost for 3 years, the United States was away from the war in Europe, and the United States was in peaceful time trying to build up and to combat the recession under the authority of Roosevelt. Then we come by far a big difference away from them are the three other strong navies. In Europe we can find the Italian Navy and the French Navy. They are both strong navies, and they are both coming as part of the allies that were victorious in First World War, and definitely these two navies were strong, but they lacked the strategic ports. They were strangulated ports that were only in the Mediterranean. So if any conflict arises, always the French Navy will be in the lake of the Mediterranean. Should be able to go to reach its on the western coast of Africa, its main port, like that's the one in Dakar, or in Wahran, or in Morocco. Still, this navy is a victim of geography. But if we say that the French Navy was a victim of geography, then definitely the Italian Navy was the poorest of them as regards geography. And therefore, in spite of having a strong armada of ships, and submarines, yet it was a doomed navy from the very start. Its only bases are in Italy, and all these bases are surrounded by, at that time of course, with a lot of friends, but sooner or later they will become part of the Axis, and therefore they will be having two enemies in the Mediterranean, not only one, the French and the British. On the other side of the world, we can find the Japanese Navy. And Japan was a very high-tech country at that time. Its boats, its ships, its submarines, and its air force was super first class. And yes, they were able to maintain the supremacy of their technology in building these beautiful, huge structures, which of course are beautiful in the appearance, but they are doomed as instruments of killing. Not only they did have this strong amount of technology in building their machines, but they also had the discipline and the perfection and the training of the Army and the Air Force and the Navy Corps of Japan. Japan was a high-tech country in a small vicinity of islands. And in order to secure the building of an empire, Japan needed a lot of raw materials because it was importing this material. So when the United States decided to give sort of regulations against the Japanese to put them down from their war, their expansion war in Asia, and especially in China, they were faced with the big problem of stoppage of the fuel supply that was inflicted by the United States on Japan. And so Japan, to avoid suffocation, decided to beat up the American Navy and to make the great adventure by bombing the Pearl Harbor and assuming it will destroy the American Navy in the ports of Pearl Harbor. Although it was victorious, although the Americans felt that they were deceived and that they were humiliated, yet, strange enough, the Japanese flotilla was not able to destroy the strong carrier fleets of America, and therefore it was not a strong defeat. And a lot of ships that were bombarded on Pearl Harbor later on were being reconstructed in the beautiful arsenals of the United States in Pearl Harbor and on the west coast, and were able to go back into the service. Not only they got back in the service the old boats, but newer models, strong models, and the models that made very easy the defeat to be on the part of the Germans or the Axis, whether this was Germany or Italy, which later on surrendered and changed hearts and changed flags on the Allies side, and Japan that was defeated in the end. So when we read such a book and we understand all these strategic details and understand how far you can build an armada, you will find in the end of the page, very away in a very distant place, the Kriegsmarine, or the German Marine, or the German Navy. The German Navy, which was under severe construction, under severe restriction in the end, because Germany was defeated in World War II, was not allowed to build strong ships or cruisers or capital ships, and it's only after the reaching of Hitler to the power that they were able to escape from the abiding rule of the treaty, and therefore were able to start building a huge navy, which was, in spite of being very high-tech and very advanced, especially in the U-boat system, and with the very shrewd navy commanders, including Ryder and, of course, Deutz, all of them, in spite of all these accuracy of the German and the professionalism that they have shown in World War II, it was a modest marine. It was in number and in personnel much less than the British Navy, and of course, after joining the Americans the war in late 1941, on the final days of 1941, German Marine, especially the U-boats or the submarines, has been subjected to extensive destruction. The high-tech of the United States of America, in the form of their new radars, in the new long-range aeroplanes that were able to spot the U-boats, and the aim of Deutz that never reached its target, which is to stop the great supply of the British war machine by destroying all the convoys that go from the west to the east. If in 1940 till 1942 this was correct, in 1943 the balance started to fall on the side of the Allies, and by the mid-1943 we can see the rising tide of the high, strong technology on the Allies side, with the destruction or the severe destruction of the German Navy or the Nazi Navy. We can see a lot of stories of drama that goes on and on in World War II. We can see old stories of war, of the Navy, and how the Japanese first fared and how the Americans had the edge. But we also have to see from the economic side of how Roosevelt. If not for Roosevelt, then the whole organization of the American economy would have failed, and the war could have lingered on for many years to come. Roosevelt was the man who was able to combat the extensive recession movement and the depression that happened in the 30s. He was the one who was able to organize the working force of the American people. And therefore, when the war came, it was him who was able to arrange with the famous business people how to make the metamorphosis of a lot of factories and a lot of arsenals into building strong aeroplanes, strong ships, and strong boats, and all the huge supply of the American Navy that in no time, within the year of 1943, has overloaded the oceans and the sea with the American Navy, and how these huge fleets and flotillas of escort ships, of liberty ships, of cruisers, of modified small carriers, huge carriers all over the United States Navy, we can find that it has doubled or even tripled the number of ships that were having in the vicinity of the British Empire. And yes, there was a new master of the seas and oceans, and that was the American Navy. And this could never have happened except with the availability of all the possible resources that are into the United States of America, beside the available high-tech and the available advanced structuring. So when we look at this period of time, we see and we understand how the United States was able to come out from World War II as a superpower. And a great way to finish the book is to see how the German Navy by mid-1942 was facing the dilemma of having its own navy being entrapped into the region of Norway and into the Northern Sea, and not able to reach the Pacific, or of course never the Pacific, not able to control or to mingle around into the Northern Atlantic as it used to happen in the early 2 years or early 3 years of the war. And when we saw the desperation that the Japanese have shown by starting their kamikaze attacks on the American Navy, we understand that these were not just gallant movements, but they were simply desperate movements, because the Japanese found out that their great aeroplanes, that they had thousands of them, the Zero targeting aeroplanes and fighters and bombers that were very high-tech in the early 40s, have been overshadowed by the new American technology planes. And of course, their only way to destroy or to try to combat is never to have a dogfight with the American pilots or the American planes, and not to try to attack these huge capital ships or the aircrafts. So they used the kamikaze attacks, and this was one of the thoughts of a rear admiral, and a Japanese rear admiral, who has decided to form the kamikaze group. And being a true Japanese, he was the first one of them, trying to give a model. So he was the first pilot of a kamikaze pilot. Although that he was a rear admiral, this means 2-star general, he went on the first plane that tried to attack one of the US carriers. So we can see that the victory on sea was done by the Allies. The huge economic background that was supplied by the United States, and the huge tech studies there, we can say very bluntly that the great defeat on the European theater and the occupation of Berlin in 1945 was the product of course, the attacking forces in Normandy, but definitely a great brunt on that was on the Soviet Red Army that was able to defeat in a fierce fight the advancing German forces and forcing them to retreat until they reached the walls of Berlin. But we know from geography that the Soviets never had a strong navy because of the fact that they are having the great suffrage of lack of deep sea ports. Their only escape of seaport is usually in the Black Sea, in Ukraine, in Odessa, and of course the eastern ones on the near Siberia. The Soviet ports over there are not as deep as the ones that the United States have. Of course, the route of supply of the convoys that were made and aided under the supervision of Churchill to supply the Soviets with great advanced American armed tanks and planes that went to supply the Soviet army as a sort of support in its fight against the Nazi army, and this was a good route of supply that was there from 1941 until 1944. So this is very interesting that the American army was supplying the Russian army with armaments and with guns and with ammunition and planes to fight Germany. Very interesting. So history is a bit strange. History is a bit of great understanding. And when we look at this interesting book by Paul Kennedy, you'll find yourself reading in between the lines the geography and the points of weakness and the strategy. So this is just a stimulant for you to read Victory at Sea, Naval Power and Transformation of the Global Order in World War II by Paul Kennedy, a book that definitely deserves to be read. So you're still listening to the World of Info, and today I'm giving you the World of Books. The 3 books of this month, and the first book was about the Navy. The second book is The Uses and the Abuses of History by Margaret Macmillan. And yes, this is an interesting book because it's a group of lectures that she has given as a sort of a stimulant course. And this was a course that is called the Joanne Goodman Lecture Series, which was established by Joanne's family and friends to perpetuate the memory of her spirit, her quest for knowledge, and the rewarding years she spent at the University of Western Ontario. So Margaret has given this sort of lectures about understanding of the uses and abuses of history. And this is very interesting. When we look at how she has dealt with it, it says this is an eminently sensible and humane book, lucidly and enjoyably written and argued. It is addressed to the general reader, and anyone interested in history should find it engaging, quick, and a quick read. Interesting. So, what does Margaret want from this book? She wants to give us a message about the importance of history. She's a historian, so definitely she's biased. But she's trying to be not biased about history and saying, does really history repeat itself? Should we look to history and see that when we see a certain action, we want to relate this to history and try to find a sort of a copycat of it? And that if something happens, then definitely we'll see how in history behaved. And the famous example, of course, is what Napoleon did when he attacked Russia, and what stupidly enough Hitler did in 1941 by attacking in Barbarossa in June 1941 the Soviet Union, and repeating the same mistake that was done by Napoleon in earlier, maybe more than 1 century, just almost about, if we may use the quick calculations, 130 years later, he committed the same mistake that was done by Napoleon Bonaparte. So actually history repeats itself? Or is it the stupidity of the leader that led to this great catastrophe? Well, this is for you to think over. And so, how far do we have to do? And how can the new directions and our models often come from the past? how often we have seen revolutionaries committed to building new worlds slip back unconsciously into the habits and ways of those they have replaced. Napoleon came to power as the result of French Revolution, but the court he set up was modeled on that of displaced Bourbons. The top Soviet communists lived within the walls of the Kremlin, as the Tsars had once done. Stalin looked back to Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great as his predecessor. And the Chinese communism scorned China's traditional society, but their top leaders chose to live right at the heart of Peking, where the imperial court had once been. Mao Zedong himself withdrew into the mysterious seclusion, much as the emperors had done over the centuries. So, Karl Marx once said, men make their own history, but they don't make it as they please. They don't make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. That's what we call food for thought. So, how far can we see that history repeats itself? Or is it the human being who has studied history, who tends to repeat and follow the footsteps of others? Or maybe this is the only thing that he knows about grandiose and what Napoleon did by following the footsteps of the Bourbons, building himself a court that resembles, if not even be more glamorous than the Bourbons themselves. So, one problem going after another. And so, when people started to say that the last veteran of World War I should be dedicated to a great finale and should be given a strong, famous, with all the pomp and circumstances, burial. And they reached this guy, and this guy, his name is Lazare Ponticelli, one of the France's last World War I veterans, said firmly, "If I turn out to be the last survivor, I say no. It will be an insult to all those who died before me and were not given any honors at all." He wanted and got a simple memorial service because he said he didn't think the nation's attention should be directed at one person when so many hundreds of thousands suffered and died. That's interesting. So a guy who was a simple soldier in First World War had more wisdom than Jacques Chirac himself, the president who had this idea to give full pomp and circumstances to the last survivor of World War I. So as we say, that definitely when we look at certain people politically in their stigma and say whether they were real strong leaders, and anticipating according to their history, we think that they will not be strong leaders after all. When we see the place being evacuated by the death of Roosevelt and his vice president, who was a new vice president, Harry Truman, who was totally secluded and excluded from the everyday routine of the White House, suddenly becoming the President of the United States in a very important golden moment, attending and witnessing the surrender and the giving in of the Axis, Germany and Europe, and later on making the decision of throwing the bomb on the nuclear bomb on Japan. These were taken on by somebody who was considered to be a real fill-in-the-space guy. A guy who was not even the vice president of Roosevelt during the past 2 terms. So, such a man, and seeing the Iron Curtain made in front of him, so Truman showed by his actions that the United States was prepared to contain the spread of Soviet influence. In 1948 and 49, the United States led the West in circumventing the Soviet blockade of the Western Zone in Berlin through a massive airlift. The next year, Truman sent American forces to Korea to beat back the attack from the Communist North on the South. The Truman administration, many would argue even today, made possible the long confrontation with the Soviet bloc and ultimately the triumph of the West in 1989. And it's really a kind of mocking that President Bush Jr., when he always put Truman as an idol, and the only thing that the Democrats used to say, don't you know that Truman was a Democrat in the end of the day? And of course Bush was a Republican. So Bush saw himself for a certain period of time as the guy who everybody was not expecting him to fight back, and he fought. He was trying to make an ideal of him and making him as an idolized. So although it was wrongfully shown and wrongfully chosen by Bush Jr. or George W. Bush to try to imitate or take Truman as a symbol of him in dealing with the 9/11 attacks. So this is definitely interesting. So how can we judge that? How can we judge history? And how can we say that this is a lie or not? Certain claims of leaders to omniscience, dictators perhaps because they know their own lies so well, have usually realized the power of history. Consequently, they have tried to rewrite, deny, or destroy the past. For example, Robespierre in revolutionary France, Pol Pot in the 70s, Cambodia, each set out to start society from the beginning again. Pol Pot's year zero were designed to erase the past and its suggestion that were alternative ways of organizing society. Here we can see even dictators are trying to use history by their own side. So that's what's so interesting about history. So how can we make things live? How can we make history survive? How can we take history as an important point for us not to fall in the same mistake again? If we keep the mistakes of the Versailles Treaty that happened in 1918-1919, when the treaty has forced the defeated to supply strong amount of money and compensations, lose parts of their established lands, and therefore cultivating the seeds of defeat and the seeds of World War II in the Versailles Treaty. And that's why probably in World War II, when there was no more regulations or more compensation to be asked from Germany, and more sacrifices after its destruction in World War II, because there was no need to break the dignity and the economy of the country and repeat again what happened wrongfully in 1919. So history is important. History will lead us to understand how to stay far away from doing or committing the same mistake again. Another important point of history. History is the only thing that can prove for you the right in your just cause. When we, for example, analyze the factors or the wars that happened in 1990 or in Versailles, the countries that were able to prove historically that they originally had the right or had a country in beginning or had the claim of the land were able to establish their countries again. Countries like Lithuania and the Baltic republics were able to be established after World War I because they could prove from history that these were strong states. A country like Lithuania had in its Duchy of Lithuania included in its perimeters the whole of Poland and reaching up to Ukraine and part of Belarus. So by presenting these documents in Versailles, they were able to rebuild the country again. The same with a country like Polonia. And of course, when we have some historical facts that are a bit shaking and they are not that strong, but you can always repeat on the minds of the others that this history is going on. Like, for example, the claim that land without country is giving, land without people is given to people without land. And this was the motto for the occupation of Palestine by the Jewish community in diaspora that came flocking into the land of Palestine from the early 20th century onwards, with the establishment of the State of Israel. Always they tried to prove historically that they had the grounds to be there. They might have been there, but beside them there was a lot of Muslims and Christians as well. They were not the only element that was there. And the fact that they always say that land without people is given to people without land should be always argued. The author has discussed that very lightly, but definitely this is very important to mention. So yes, how can we go into a conclusion after reading this interesting book? We'll definitely see that it has been a great, joyful reading of almost 150 pages about why should we take history and use it without abuse. So after the break, we'll go to the final conclusion. Stay tuned with us in the World of Info. So you're still listening to the World of Books, coming live from Studio 3 in the World of Info, and today's program is about 3 interesting books, and we are finalizing our final comment about this beautiful prose, The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret Macmillan. And in the final conclusion, she gives us a beautiful statement. So one of the history's most useful tasks is to bring home to us how keenly, honestly, and painfully past generations pursued aims that now seem to us wrong or disgraceful. Think of the arguments over the position of the Earth and the Sun. Is the Earth the center of the universe? Of the conviction apparently supported by science that so many Victorians had that there were superior and inferior races. Or the calm assumptions, even a few decades ago, that women and blacks could not make good engineers or doctors. If the study of history does nothing more than teach us humility and skepticism, then it has done something useful. We must continue to examine our own assumptions and those of others and ask, where is the evidence, or is there another explanation? We should be wary of grand claims in history's name, or those who claim to have uncovered the truth once and for all. And in the end, the only advice is use it, enjoy it, but always handle history with care. The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret Macmillan. That's one interesting book to read, and I promise you it's going to be interesting. The number of incidents that she has described, the number of facts that she has analyzed, really deserves to be read. It's beautiful, it's written carefully, and the prose will make it easy for you to go through these beautiful 125 pages very smoothly and very easily. So this leaves us with the final book after the break in the World of Info. So the last book in today's episode is The Days of Selim I in Egypt by Helmi Namnam, the ex-Minister of Culture, a very highly educated man. He's a graduate from the History Department of the Faculty of Literature or the Faculty of Arts, and definitely he has led a very colorful life as a journalist, a renowned journalist. His books are of great interest, and this book is interesting because Selim I stayed in Egypt only for 8 months. And after his conquest of Egypt, he died maybe 4 years later. And his work has been overshadowed by his son Suleiman, or the Suleiman the Just, or Suleiman al-Qanuni, or the Magnificent Suleiman. So when we talk about Selim I, we have to discuss that these were the one of the bitterest part of our history. And as Helmi Namnam claims, we can always find the period of the Ottoman rule of Egypt, or the Ottoman, I like to call it the Ottoman occupation of Egypt, was drastic days. It continued practically from 1516 or 1517 till the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798. But nominally, it stayed ruling Egypt until 1923, with the declaration of the independence. Although Egypt was taken up as a protectorate by the British in 1914, but officially it stayed belonging to the Ottoman Empire. So for 400 years, nominally, and practically for almost 300 years, less than 300 years, Egypt was under the authority of the Ottomans, and Egypt has never known more backward days or more drastic times than the times spent under the Ottoman rule. The invasion of Egypt by Selim I carried and demolished these strong, but becoming weaker by that, the strong Sultanate, Mamluk Sultanates, or the Charkas Mamluk. Khonso al-Ghori was the last Sultan of Egypt, and the Mamluks, who carried in themselves the gene of the military genes, the magnificent intelligence and the strong love for art, culture, religion, and military affairs that started with them from the Salih Najmuddin period up till onwards, with the great days of Zahir Baybars and of Qutuz, who defeated the Mughals, and Zahir Baybars, who almost defeated most of the Crusaders, and the work that was continued by Khalil ibn Qalawun in 1791 with the throwing of the Crusaders out of the Middle East. All this strong empire carried in it the seeds of weakness, especially in the Sharq's time, with the strong fights that they had in between themselves, and the weak sultans that went up to the throne. Always Egypt was secure with its monopoly that maintained into between the trade between the East and the West, until the discovery of the Portuguese to the route of Good Hope that passes through Africa and reaches India. And Egypt has lost a lot of its taxation, and the monopoly that was Egypt, and the Venetian merchants were controlling the trade between the East and the West. So Egypt, when it became poor and weak, was easily taken up by Selim I, who advanced his army, not going through or abiding by the rules of the religion that prohibits Muslims from fighting each other. Not only did he fight Egypt, but he was the reason for the killing or the murder or the death of Khonso al-Ghori, and definitely he has condemned Sultan Tuman Bai, the last Sultan of Egypt, to death and on the gallows in 1517. The 1517 defeat of Ad-Raidaniyah, and then the entrance of Selim I to Egypt and to Cairo on the 15th of February 1517, and he's leaving Egypt 7 or almost 8 months later, marks a great defeat of Egypt. He not only allowed his forces to beat up the Sharkas Mamluks and their families, and to apply all the rules of theft to their fortunes and killings, but also he has taken up, he and his soldiers, the money of the well-bred and the middle class of the Egyptians. And unfortunately, he has taken up the middle class, the whole of the middle class of the Egyptians, including the architects, the industrialists, and the people who were artists and even the judges, and shipped them to Istanbul, because as he saw how Cairo was beautiful, he said, I want Istanbul to be as beautiful as Cairo. So he transferred all these men of high technique and artists, taking them and took them to Istanbul, where they worked there under complete strong regulations, as if they were in jail. And therefore you can see that the art of the Ottoman Empire after 1516 is completely different than its art before 1516, and you can see the finesse of the Egyptian worker in Istanbul when you visited into the mosques that were built after 1516 and 1517. And unfortunately, you can see the great deterioration in the work of art and the artist's work of Egypt, starting even from 1527, when we see the mosque, or the 1528, the mosque of Suleiman Pasha in the citadel, which was the first Ottoman mosque in Egypt, a small mosque in the citadel that has a beautiful arrangement of Ottoman style, a minaret and a dome. But when you see the art inside, you will find that it's completely different than the art that was there before the entrance of the Ottomans. Because, for example, the peak was reached by the work in Konso al-Ghori mosque and mausoleum. We can see the great theft that happened to a lot of mosques, or Egyptian mosques, when a lot of marble has been taken up from the Egyptian mosques to be shipped to Istanbul. Selim I was a tyrant. Selim I invaded Egypt, and he was responsible for destroying the Sultanate, or the Mamluk Sultanate. So any information that says that Selim I came as a great victorious guy and was expected and respected by the Egyptians is not true. The Ottoman rule of Egypt was responsible for a great deal of the going backward of the Egyptian society. And even during Muhammad Ali's time, when the Ottomans forced on Egyptian and tried to arrange for the Treaty of London, that has put down the great progress of Muhammad Ali and forced his army to retreat to the borders of Cairo and Sinai. And of course, the other defeat, that when the Sultan has decided in 1882 to consider Arabi as a defeatist and as a traitor, and therefore has helped very much in Egypt falling in the hands of the British occupation in 1882. So when we talk about this Ottoman period, we say that it was a dark period in the ruling of Egypt, and definitely Selim I was not a man of charity or of pity. He was a tyrant who came to Egypt and was responsible for the death and destruction. So I think the three books deserve to be read, and I think that today I tried to give you some light about books to be read during May. These were the books: Paul Kennedy, Victory at Sea, Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global Order in World War II, The Uses and Abuses of History by Margaret Macmillan, and last but not least, The Days of Selim I in Egypt, The Roots of Terrorism by Helmi Namnam. May I wish you a very pleasant afternoon in Egypt and a beautiful weekend in Cairo, and hope that you have enjoyed the program, and I promise to come back next week, same time, same station, coming live from Studio 3. I am Dr. Amr MABROUK. Dua Muhammad was at the control, and stay tuned to Radio Cairo.